We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we are joined by Liberty Nation's economics guru, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. And I'm wearing black and white, and you're wearing black and white. Look at that.
This is actually a dark blue and a purple.
Oh.
So, sorry, we don't clash. I know you want to get into that whole thing. We both turned up here clashing, but sorry, dude. Anyway, what I want to get your opinion on today, Andrew, is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or the TCJA, appears to be making its way back to America. Now, this is one of the most highly contentious pieces of legislation from Trump's first administration, where we hear so much from both sides. It's kind of difficult to know what to believe. So on the Republican side, what we hear is that it created wealth for millions and millions of people. And from the Democrat side, we hear that wealth was largely in the hands of the uber rich. Now, I'm presuming that the truth is somewhere down the middle, Andrew, but could you give us your view from 30,000 feet on that?
Yeah. So when I look at this issue, I read through all what the experts say, what the Tax Foundation, the Tax Policy Center, all these experts, and they all provide clashing opinions. So instead, what I did is I actually looked at the government data to see, okay, what happened in the aftermath of the TCJA when it was enacted in 2018. So federal tax revenues actually rose $1.5 trillion to around $5 trillion from the year when it was enacted in 2018 to the end of 2024. Employment also ballooned before the pandemic. It rose from 147.5 million to more than 152 million from the enactment of TCJA to February 2020. Real hourly wages, that's inflation-adjusted hourly wages, increased 5% cumulatively in 2018 and 2019. And then, of course, here's the meat and potatoes of it, because the Democrats will always say, oh, it only benefited the wealthy, it didn't benefit anybody else. The rich have to pay their fair share, yada, yada, yada. So here's from the IRS data itself. So the top 1%, they now pay 46% of all income taxes. Before the TCJA was enacted, they paid 37%. The top 10%, they pay 76% of all income taxes, up from 70%. And then finally, the bottom 50%, they pay 2% of all taxes, down from 3% in 2016. So those are the results from the TCJA. This is the government data. It's not independent analysis. It's just what the government is saying.
So essentially, since the implementation of the TCJA, the wealthier in society ended up paying a larger proportion of the tax take, and the poor in society ended up paying a lower amount. And you would say that that's the indisputable figure.
Well, that's the U.S. government's numbers. It's not just come out of nowhere. That's exactly what the U.S. government is reporting.
So moving to the political slightly, then, would you say that the criticism of it is more about partisanship, or are there elements to be concerned about with the TCJA?
Well, the new concern. Yes. Well, so the latest concern from the one side of the political aisle are based on projections of how bad this TCJA is going to be for the budget. Now, all of a sudden, one specific side of the aisle is so worried about the deficit, how much it's going to balloon under the TCJA, because the estimates suggest that it's going to, if you extend the TCJA, you're going to add about $4.5 trillion to the budget deficit. The Republicans will say, well, that's not exactly true, because when the TCJA was first proposed, the Congressional Budget Office, that's the nonpartisan budget watchdog, it forecast that revenues would fall. Lo and behold, the CBO had to rescore its numbers and show, okay, well, actually the TCJA brought in more revenue than was expected. Now, the CBO, it's a very reliable organization, but now it's making the same case. It's also projecting that if the TCJA is enacted, not only is it going to lower revenues, but is also going to slow down economic growth, which is contradictory to what a lot of private economists are forecasting. They say, yes, okay, fine, the revenues are going to fall, but growth will increase and jobs will rise if the TCJA is made permanent.
So it's essentially it's a dip and a rise theory, isn't it? This whole thing. So if revenues fall, tax revenues fall, but there's a greater willingness to either A, invest, B, create a business, C, hire more people because you have more of your own cash in your pocket, then that eventually drives. So it's a dip and then it's a rise. Is that how that works?
Okay, so there's two things here. So you have the famous Laffer curve, which determines that when there's an optimal tax rate, you're actually going to raise revenue as opposed to taxing everyone to death, and you'll have the opposite effect. The other part of the equation now is CBO. They're worried about having a crowding out effect. So this is the economics term suggesting that if you have a higher deficit, the U.S. Treasury will have to borrow more, and it does that by issuing more debt, thereby crowding out private investment and private capital. So then, therefore, where there's less private capital, there's less investments for small businesses, as you alluded to. There's going to be fewer jobs, and that's what they're concerned about, because the deficit, of course, is going to keep growing if it has less revenue. So that's the balance you have to make. But as I've always said over the years of the TCJA, it's great. Yeah, revenues did rise, but you have to also focus on the spending side of everything going on in Washington. Great, you can collect a record amount of $5 trillion, which is astounding. But if you're spending $8 trillion, then of course you're going to have that. You're going to have that imbalance. It has nothing to do with revenues. It's always a spending problem.
So, Andrew, I want to delve a little deeper into what America can expect over the next 4 years regarding tax. So, Donald Trump's pushing for the Tax Cut and Jobs Act to come back. Other things. He also floated recently the idea, again, this is not the first time he said it, of getting rid of income tax altogether, federal income tax altogether. Now, it's I know there's people out there going, no tax on your income. I know that there's and obviously replacing it with tariffs on goods brought in from overseas. Now, if you've got the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, isn't that running contrary to the idea that there will be something set up with removing income tax altogether?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So it's just perhaps President Trump floating his ideas, thinking out loud with everybody. I mean, in a way, on one side, yeah, it would be great to eliminate the income tax. That's fantastic. Abolishing it. There was no income tax until 1913. The problem, and then having you'd have to have 100% tariff to make up for the lost revenue. But the problem is that, once again, yes, eliminating income tax would be remarkable for the U.S. economy. The challenge is, once again, the spending side. If you're losing about $3 trillion of revenue, what's going to happen to that $7 trillion in spending? Well, actually, by the year 2035, according to the CBO, it's going to be $10.5 trillion. So how are you going to pay for all the spending? Are you actually going to cut? And that always seems unlikely by both sides of the aisle.
It's the third rail of politics, isn't it? It's cutting things. Although I know that Elon Musk with DOGE now is looking at, I believe he's estimating that they can probably manage about $2 trillion a year. However, I wonder if that's a little ambitious. I mean, $2 trillion a year cut from spending would be amazing, but it does seem fractionally ambitious, I think.
Yep. Yeah, so actually, Elon Musk, he was interviewed about this issue a few weeks ago. I mentioned it on C5 TV, and he actually lowered that estimate. He said, yeah, $2 trillion is great, but the more realistic one is about $500 billion. Now, if you go on the U.S. Debt Clock website, you see there's actually a DOGE widget now, and it shows at the time of this recording that the U.S. government has saved about $30 billion based on DOGE. Now, I have zero clue on how they're getting these numbers, where they're getting, how accurate it is, but $30 billion in 1 week. I mean, that's a good start. Will it reach $2 trillion? I'm very skeptical.
Okay, it'd be interesting to find out. So there are other tax things going ahead. Now, I just want to play you a very short clip, Andrew, and come back to me on what you think about it.
No tax on tips.
No tax on tips. So if you're a restaurant worker, a server, a valet, a bellhop, a bartender, or one of my caddies, I go through caddies like candy. If I play badly, I always blame my caddy. or any other worker who relies on tipped income, your tips will be 100% yours.
What do you make of that?
Well, actually, I wrote an article this past summer analyzing whole Trump's tax policies, and there was one estimate from the Tax Foundation, and it said that over 10 years, if you remove taxes on tips, the federal revenues would decline about $118 billion. Now, once again, there's a growth aspect to it that's usually lost on a lot of these estimates. Now, what I'm concerned about is the inflationary aspect of it. Now, if more of these workers have their income, they're going to be bidding up the price of goods. So once again, you have that inflationary component whereby you have too much money chasing few too goods. So you have the balance of, will this raise enough revenue? Will it worsen the deficit? And will it be inflationary? So those are the two things you have to look at when it comes to this policy.
Andrew, thanks for talking to me on this topic. We're going to actually delve into something that's a lot closer to home, for example, in the next part. See you soon.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.